Hello, I'm Katie Adams, curator at the Tread of Pioneers Museum. Hey, did you know that our local newspaper, the Steamboat Pilot, is turning 135 years old this year? Isn't that amazing? It's the longest running business in our town. In fact, I'm standing in front of the very first front page of the very first edition of the Steamboat Pilot, dated July 31st, 1885. Now, as you may know, we're continuing our annual Brown Bag Storytelling series in a virtual fashion this year. I've cold recorded presentations to represent during this pandemic season for you. This one was recorded in 1998 by newspaper editor Charles Leckenby. It's perfect to help celebrate this monumental 135-year anniversary, and it'll provide you with a little bit more information and background on the history of the pilot, as well as the history of the Leckenby family, who ensured the survival of the newspaper for so many years. Remember, you can learn more. You can get our summer event information on our website, and that website address is treadofpioneers.org. Here's Chuck.
I'm Jane Hill. I'm past president of the board for Tread of Pioneers Museum. And our director has gone to California this week, so I'm standing in for it, and my privilege is to introduce Chuck Leckenby. And his name and newspapers in this town have been synonymous for over 100 years. His grandfather was 16 when he came to this area, worked as an apprentice in the newspaper, and eventually bought it. And the rest of that story is Chuck's. Chuck?
Thank you. I've already been scooped. I got this newspaper today, and everything I was going to say is in here. So if you'll just read that, and I'll go play golf. Actually, when they asked me to speak, I asked them what day it was, and they said, well, it'd be July 31st. And I said, well, that's a coincidence, because the first pilot was printed on July 31st, 1885, and this is the copy of it right here. And it's the only, as far as I know, it's the only copy, and I had it framed. It was in the office for a long, long time, and I gave it to the museum to do whatever they want to do with it. But it was like a 4-page paper, and this is the only thing that's left of it. But I'll get into some of the printing techniques and some of the things how hard it was to really put a newspaper out in those days, and it's gotten a lot easier, although it's gotten a lot more expensive too. But another significant thing is, probably some of you know it, but some of you don't, but the museum is called Tread of Pioneers Museum, and it was actually named after a book that my granddad had written in 1945, and he got the name of the book from a quote from Whittier, and I'll read it to you because I think it's really apropos today. I hear the tread of pioneers of nations yet to be, the first low wash of waves where soon shall roll a human sea. So that's pretty apropos for today, especially driving downtown. So he took this quote and I hear the Tread of Pioneers, and named his book The Tread of Pioneers. And basically, he was the editor of the paper. He bought the paper in 1896 for $100, and that was his true love, and he was known as being one of the great editorial writers of that time. And he was also involved in politics, like my father was. And I just there's a couple things in here I wanted you to see in this, or point out in the book, and one of them is the town was formed by James Crawford, and they actually the township gave Mr. Hoyle, who was James Hoyle, he was from Boulder, he started the newspaper, and they gave him the lot where actually it's called Lincoln Avenue Printers now, but it's a stone building down next to Pilot Office Supply. And they gave him the land, and he put up a little log building that's a picture of it. So the paper was started in this little log building, and then a few years later, why this building here, the log building was torn down, and they built this two-story building, and this is where my father was born, upstairs in that building. And next to this building was the livery stable. And this is a picture of the livery stable with the old stagecoaches. And in 1909, why the livery stable caught on fire, and it burned the livery stable down and also burned this building down. And that's where they built the building that's there now. So that building that's there now has been there since 1909. I did find this thing in the paper the other day. It said, who are the most respected occupations? And it says doctors lead, and at the very bottom it has journalists, 15%. That made me feel real good. I've kind of gone over some of this. Actually, my grandfather, in 1917, he was elected to state auditor, and he was involved in politics, so he went down and was state auditor for a year, and I'm not sure who ran the newspaper then, but I'm sure somebody did. And then my father came back in about the year after that, and he worked there for a little while, and then my father, actually, when he was 16, he went to Denver and went to work as a reporter for the news, and he worked for the Denver Post and worked for the AP. And when my grandfather died in 1950, when my father had come back, moved the family back, actually, we were living in Denver, and that's kind of another misconception. A lot of people think I'm a native or was born in Steamboat. I was actually born in Denver. I probably shouldn't tell anybody that because they think but I was born in Denver, and I moved here in 1945 with my family, and that's when my father took over the newspaper, and he ran it. And when I grew up here, I went to high school, and then I went to the University of Colorado, and I went in the Air Force, and then when I was in the Air Force, my father called up one day and he said, well, I got a chance to go back to Washington, D.C. to be the administrative assistant to Senator John Carroll, who was one of his best friends here in Colorado. And so he went back to Washington, D.C., and that's when I came back. I was up in the state of Washington, and I had a degree from the University of Colorado in journalism, but I really, when I was growing up here, I thought, boy, this is really a hick town, and I don't want to be here. And sure enough, I ended up back here, and I thought, well, I'll come back and just stay a couple years, and then I'll go do something else. So, but I never left, and I raised a family here, and it's been a great experience. And then for the whole time I was the editor, actually it didn't do any work. This little lady over here, Dee Richards, did all the work for me. She was my editor, and without her, I don't know how I'd have gotten by, because she took the bull by the horns and did a lot of really neat things for the community. So I appreciate that, Dee. There was something, a couple of things, I'm kind of jumping around here, but my grandfather actually came from Missouri, where he was working, and his brother was living here in Steamboat, and so he decided to come here, and he took the train from Missouri to a place in Wyoming, and from there to get here, it took him 11 months. It was during the winter, and they almost starved to death coming over the mountains, and they camped out, and I mean, in those days, you wonder how anybody survived, but they did. My grandfather, in this book, has a lot of local history, and unfortunately, when there's not too many of these books floating around, but when he first printed the book, he printed 500, and when I came back, there was such a demand for them. The book was selling for like $200 a copy, and I decided, well, if there's that much demand, we ought to print it again. So I printed 1,500 copies and sold them for $10, and actually I think I've got about 3 books left. And I think the museum, I gave the museum some books to sell to raise money one time, and I don't know if they have any left or not. But it's kind of a, if you don't have one, it's worth whatever you're selling them for, $200. It's sort of my grandfather's, he just kind of took some different things, historical things, and wrote about them. And then at the very end of the book, he kind of went into some of his philosophy of running a newspaper and some of the things he did. And I thought there were a couple things in here. He says, no matter what the changes, there will always be a place for a country newspaper. And keeping things out of the paper is a problem demanding judgment and good sense. And I know Dee can relate to that. About every other week, somebody call up and say, hey, I got a DUI. Will you leave my name out of the paper? So we kind of had a hard, fast rule. It didn't matter who it was. We couldn't make exceptions. We put your name in the paper if you got picked up for a DUI. But it caused some real problems, and a few other things caused some problems. But it was an interesting time, and one I'll never forget. Here's one that's sort of apropos with President Clinton. It says, scandals, especially those involving sex, which are worth red headlines in the metropolitan paper, should be played down or ignored by the country newspaper. He kind of hit it on the head there, I guess. There's no hard and fast rule. It all comes down to using horse sense. So he was a pretty basic guy, and felt like the community, a community newspaper basically was his philosophy, and I think my philosophy is that it's about the people in the community. And even if, I know we used to have a little column in the paper about who went to lunch or who had a tea party or who played bridge that day and who had a baby at the hospital, and those things seem really trivial except to the people that they're happening to, and those were really the important things, and we tried to emphasize those in the paper and keep it about the people. And I think we did a pretty good job when we were doing it. One thing, my grandfather was not too well known, but he was one of the original Moffat Tunnel commissioners, and this was an elected office, and he was on the original board. And a little known fact, and in fact I didn't really think about it, but the railroad came in here in 1909, and David Moffat, who was the first governor of Colorado, this was his dream, and he put up the money, and he kind of ramrodded this thing, and then he went broke when it got to Steamboat. And another guy took over, put some more money in, and they got as far as Craig, and then he went broke. But the funny thing is, and I didn't realize this, when the Moffat Tunnel was not completed until, well, here's another, while they're building the railroad, it cost $14 million to build a railroad from Denver to Steamboat. It was $75,000 a mile. And the railroad came here in 1909, but the tunnel actually wasn't built until 1923. So you say, how did the train get over here? Well, it actually came over Rollins Pass. It came over kind of where Berthoud Pass is. So it was the highest railroad in the world at that time. That was not a small track railroad. It was a regular track railroad. And so it was started in 1923 and finished in 1927. So it took 4 years to build that tunnel. And can anybody guess how much the tunnel cost? Well, anyway, I'll tell you in a second here, but my granddad, they sent him back to New York City, and he stayed at the Waldorf Astoria. And they brought a car down, special car down to him, and he went to Wall Street. And they went to a bank with armed guards, and they signed a check, a deposit slip for $6,720,000. So that's basically what the Moffat Tunnel costs. And then that debt was just recently, I guess it was about 8 or 10 years ago, it was paid off. But it was paid off with a property tax, or a Moffat Tunnel, a tunnel tax that's on your property. And that was paid off a number of years ago. But it took from 1920 27 to just a couple years ago to pay off this $6 billion, and I'm sure the interest was probably 10 times that on the tunnel. But anyway, I didn't realize the train was in here, but actually before the tunnel was. So that was kind of an amazing thing.
That's like a 2% railroad rate too. I've been up that once there, but I think it's about 2%.
Where the old railroad.
Rollins Pass.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was just kind of the highlights of my grandfather's book, which is sort of semi-famous. Now, my father wrote a book which is not famous at all. Nobody even knows about it, and in fact, I don't even know how many copies there are. In fact, this is the only copy I have. But he did a book, Put a Head on It, which is kind of a double meaning. If you put a head on it in a bar, you put a head of beer, some foam on the head of the beer. But I think he meant put a head on it, which is a newspaper term. Do you want to come in and sit down? Put a head on it was actually put a headline on the story, and so that's where the book got its name. And a couple of things one thing that my father did in the meantime of working in Denver and working here, so he started a newspaper in Oak Creek, which lasted about a year, and then he went broke doing that. But that was in the days when Oak Creek was kind of booming as a mining town, and it lasted for a little while. In this book it was really pretty funny. It's called a handbook for politicians, and I think my father and a couple of his cronies used to get drunk all the time and put these things together because they're really pretty funny. They have a glossary in here, and keep in mind this is a handbook for politicians. It's campaign manager, a shrewd, realistic fellow who does a candidate's thinking and receives a juicy appointment if everything turns out all right. Committee women and committee men, precinct officers who do the legwork and receive none of the credit when their party is successful. And then they have an orator in here, a man who can talk entertainingly for an hour without committing himself or the party to anything specific. So they went on and on and on about that, which was kind of funny, I thought. And then at the end here it says, don't worry about which party you pick. And back in those days, a lot of newspapers were supported by politicians because they wanted to get the word out how great they were. And there'd be a Democratic newspaper, which this one was for a long time, and then somebody would start another newspaper because they didn't like what they were saying, so they started a Republican paper. And there were actually two newspapers in town. One was called the Routt County Sentinel, and one was the Steamboat Pilot. And over a period of time, my grandfather bought both of them. And then, and in fact, at one time with that building, if you look at the Pilot building that's there now, which is now Lincoln Avenue Printers, it's kind of like two 25-foot buildings kind of stuck together. Both newspapers were in there with one inside one and one on the other. So politics seemed to have played a real major role in the newspaper business, and evidently supported a lot of newspapers that kept them going.
What was the circulation in those days, Chuck?
Well, it was just like a couple hundred circulation. Of course, you know, the figures, when I had the paper, that we were doing about 6,000. I don't know what they're up to now, maybe 8,000 in the weekly, huh?
It's like 9,000.
At 9,000. And then, of course, I started the daily newspaper, and of course, we did that actually after I sold out in 1988. Sold the paper to Jack Kent Cooke, who owns the Washington Redskins, and he owned the Daily News out in Los Angeles. And his idea was going to be to buy up all the ski resort newspapers, and he tried to buy Aspen and Vail and Sun Valley and Jackson Hole, and he ended up buying this one, and he ended up buying 3 in New Mexico and 1 in Arizona. And then those papers were sold by him a couple years ago to a fellow by the name of Dolph Simon, who lives in Lawrence, Kansas. He owns the newspaper in Lawrence, Kansas. He owns the TV cable company in Fort Collins. And then they just bought the Craig and Hayden paper not too long ago. So that's who owns the paper now. A couple other things I wanted to show you. When I sold the paper, they did a kind of a special section, and it kind of shows the old press room in the building that's down there. And then this picture here, I guess, is that picture. And then the picture of the stage barn burning down, which burned this building down. And then in here they did a sort of a section on myself and my father and my grandfather. I was going to try to get some pieces off the old Linotype. I don't know if any of you know what a Linotype is, but it was when they first did this newspaper back in those days, they actually had to pick out of a type case. It's called a California type case, and it had compartments in it with all the letters of the alphabet. And you actually had to pick out every single letter of every word and put them together in a form, and they'd lock them in a chase like this. And in that, those are basically zinc cuts that are locked in rather than type. But when they call it letterpress printing, this is actually what Gutenberg invented way back when, is taking a form and locking it in another form and then putting ink on it and then smashing the paper on it, so that it's actually what they call letterpress. It's actually pressing the paper onto the thing, and the ink would come off and stick to the paper. So for years and years and years, up until not too many years ago, this was the way you did a newspaper. And physically, when we were doing the paper when it was still letterpress, we printed 4 pages on Monday, 4 pages on Tuesday, and 4 pages on Wednesday. And it took a whole day to put 4 pages together. And this is actually out of a Linotype machine. It was invented right at the turn of the century by a guy called Mergenthaler. And in a Linotype machine is this kind of big old weird looking machine, and in there are brass mats that have the letters of the alphabet. And a guy would sit there and hit these keys, and these little brass things would fall down this chute, and they'd fall into a form. And in the back of this machine was a pot of hot lead. And that's why when you went into an old newspaper shop, it always smelled like crazy, because they were cooking this, they were melting this lead all the time. So these brass forms were stuck in this form, and the lead would squirt the lead in, and then the lead would harden in about 30 seconds, and it would spit this thing out. And this was called a slug, and it's got type on it. So after they did away with when this machine came around, they could do things a little faster, because they didn't have to hand pick all this type out of this type case. They could do this. But even doing this, it took about an hour to set what we call a Gallia type, which would be a Gallia type is like the 1 column wide, the length of the newspaper. It would take about an hour to set 1 Gallia type. Yes.
Did they then melt that down after they used it and reused it?
Yeah, right. And that was the other thing. Think of, especially back in the days when they're picking every one of these letters out. After you picked them all out and printed, then you had to put them all back in. I mean, it took forever. I mean, it's amazing they got as much done as they did. But the Linotype, of course, speeded things up and with the old letterpress. And this is just a piece of type. This is actually what they call a 120-point piece of type. So that's a letter O. But if you have a 6-point piece of type, you can barely see it. So and a lot of the old type was wood type, and then they started making it out of metal. And of course, we would still kind of be in the dark ages if somebody had invented some new way of printing. And actually what they did is they came up with a process called offset printing. And basically it's a photographic process. And for a long time, right after the Linotype machines, along came what they called a phototype machine. And what it did is you sit there and you punch it, and a light would go on and off, and it had a film strip on it. And it would actually take pictures of every letter of the alphabet as you were typing. And you'd have this big box, and it had film in it, and you'd take it and stick the film in a processor, and you'd pull it out and hope something was on there. And normally it would be the printed whatever you typed, and then this was pasted onto a piece of paper, and then that piece of paper was taken into the dark room, and the dark room we shot a negative, and I just brought a negative from the print shop. And then what happened is the negative was taken with a piece of aluminum plate and burn on what they call a plate burner, and the image is burned onto this plate through a photographic process, and then wiped with chemicals, and then the image comes out, and then this is put on a printing press, and you print from this plate. And one sort of misconception, and that's the reason they call it offset, you don't actually print direct from the plate. What you do is you put the image on a rubber blanket, and then the rubber blanket puts it back onto the paper, and that's why they call it offset, because it's actually offsetting from the plate onto the blanket and then back onto the paper. So with the advent of the offset printing, of course, after the phototype machines, along came the computer. They're using Macintoshes now. The computer came along, and it spits out all kinds of type, and in fact, now they're doing pagination, which basically you don't have to set all the rows of type and paste it all together. You can actually do a page on the computer and move stuff around and put headlines and stuff on it. Yes?
Now that they use this word processing or whatever with Macintosh, like, do they use like word spell or something? Because it seems like there's more misspelled words.
Well, you know, there's a spell check in the computer programs, and basically before the computers we had what we called a proofreader, and the proofreader we'd proof everything, and the proofreader would very diligently take, in fact, maybe you know one of our proofreaders, June Bontaine, who still lives here part of the time, and they would read it very carefully and mark all the mistakes, and then you'd go back and retype these things and put the corrections in, and hopefully everything was right. But I think nowadays, I think basically, I don't think they proofread anything that I'm aware of.
They do. They just have like such a tight schedule with everyone that like the same people who lay out the paper also have to copy it and everything all within like 6 hours, and it's really hard.
Yeah, that they're under a real time deal, especially with the daily. They're doing it. In fact, that daily they're working all night to get the thing out the next morning. So they're under some pretty tight schedules. And but theoretically, the computer is supposed to correct the spelling. And of course, I'm sure when it gets some funny different words, if you all use a computer, there are a few words it doesn't recognize and spits out some funny spelling and so forth. Yeah.
Well, the one in particular, about a year or so ago, they were talking about the near on a building, and it came off as Vermeer, finger.
Yeah. Well, again, on the computer, if the words are similar, that sometimes it spits out the wrong words. So anyway, that's kind of a quick background. One thing I didn't point out, again, this kind of goes back to the politics. I gave these pictures to the museum. This is my grandfather. When he went back in 1913 to the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, who was sitting here, President Woodrow Wilson. And this is my grandfather right here. So he loved politics, and he was involved in, I think he liked politics maybe a bit more than newspaper business, but he in his book he says that he ran for office 4 times, but he only got elected once, and that, I guess that kind of put a kibosh on his political career. And then my father was actually, he never was really a politician up front, but he was always behind the scenes, and all his buddies were the politicians, and he was actually the Democratic State Committeeman of the state of Colorado, and that's how he ended up back in Washington, D.C. But when he was back there, he had lunch with John Kennedy, and this is a picture of my father and John Kennedy, and it was they had the lunch menu here, so if you want to take a look at that. Some French words.
Do you have brothers and sisters? Do you have children?
Do I?
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I was a spoiled only brat, and I have 4 children, and I have 3 daughters and a son, and the 3 daughters all married and off and never were involved in the newspaper, and my son was like most teenagers when he's grown up, he didn't know what he wanted to do, and that was the last thing he wanted to do, was get in the newspaper business. And then after I sold the newspaper, he ended up with a journalism degree from Colorado State University, but it was kind of unfortunate, but by then it was too late. So that was kind of a quick family thumbnail, yes.
We're here celebrating my 70th birthday, and I was born here in Steamboat in 1928.
Oh, well, good.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
They were all native.
So,
My grandfather was a farrier here, and my dad worked at the mercantile building here,
oh, yes. What is your name?
Bergman.
Bergman.
He probably remembers the day he was born.
Well, Vernon Summers been here forever. He knows everybody. So.
I'll have to tell something right off. My people took the pilot, as long as I can remember, before my time. And I doubt if there was an editorial that Charlie Leckenby wrote that my dad didn't read. And one time he was talking, he said, you know, Charlie's an awful smart man. But he said, if anybody's a Republican, he said he won't say a good word for him. And then when Morris took over in 1950, wasn't it?
Yes.
Dad said, well, Morris was just as bad as Charlie.
Yeah, they were definitely die-in-the-wool Democrats. But they kind of grew up as a working man and didn't have a whole lot, and they were kind of for the underdog, I guess. I'm sure that the whole political thing's changed quite a bit since then, but that's kind of where they came from. Yes.
If your grandfather came here when he was 16, did he marry someone locally, or did he?
You know, he married and in fact, I didn't realize it, but his wife her name was Laura DeWitt, and she was from Prescott, Arizona. And he was down there working in that area and married her from Prescott, Arizona. And I don't know much about her family at all, but her name was DeWitt. So, yes.
When your grandfather paid $100 originally for the newspaper, did that include the printing materials?
That was everything, yeah. The building, the area. So I guess you could say newspapers weren't worth a whole lot, but.
When your grandfather owned both newspapers, he didn't ever get his editorials mixed up, did he?
You know, they shut down the other paper after they bought it down. They didn't want 2 voices. And Dee was my editor for 20 years, and she and I never agreed on anything, but it was kind of a neat deal because she would write her little column and editorialize about what she thought, and then I would sort of take the opposite view. So actually, we kept everybody happy. Well, not everybody, but, you know, almost, huh?
Well, there were people who walked across the street rather than have to pass me.
Yes.
Was there ever, did you ever have an unpopular cause where, I don't know, you know, people were, you know, throwing rocks through your windows? I don't mean necessarily yours,
Yeah.
maybe going back.
Well, actually, everybody agreed with me, and nobody agreed with Dee, so they threw rocks at her.
What about before that? What about with your grandfather, your father? Did they ever tell stories about that? Or?
You know, I don't.
Maybe not.
I'm sure there was some disagreements about things. Probably in recent times, the biggest controversy has been Catamount. You know, I mean, those for and those against, and you know, we could debate that all day. I won't get into that one.
James Brown Bridge.
Yeah, the James Brown's Bridge. Yeah.
Remember the whole coyote hunting thing that Carl Creel kicked off? He wrote about.
Oh yeah, hunting coyotes.
There were letters for 6 months of them raging back and forth.
Yeah. Christine, by the way, she was one of my reporters for years and years, and now works as a PR lady at the hospital. So
What was the argument about with the coyotes? Was it
Well, it was people who felt they that they should be hunted, and people who felt that was horrible. So, and it just went back and forth, and it escalated, and it kept the letters to the editor section has always been really a special part of the pilot, I think, going back probably forever.
Yeah.
And, if you wanted to know what was going on in the town in the 70s or 80s, all you had to do was flip to the letters page and you'd find out. Everyone felt free to pen whatever.
Well, and we always, when we did the letters to the editor, we always felt, I mean, even if we'd get some really kind of nasty letters, but we printed it and pretty much printed everything, you know, unless it was libelous, and in fact, we even did a few libelous. I only got sued twice, one for $5 million and one for $10 million, but fortunately, they didn't win. But it used to be back in the days you could almost not libel anybody. I mean, you could call anybody almost anything you want and not get sued. I mean, you might get sued for libel, but you'd never win. And that's gradually changed over. There's been some people that have, some libel cases in recent years that have gotten some publications in some big trouble. So, but back when I was running the paper and before that, it was almost an impossibility. But yes.
So you never had anything, like I saw something on television the other night where a small town newspaper was trying to show that the sheriff was extorting money or whatever. He didn't have, and they would get death threats and just kind of, you never had anything like that happen?
Oh, we had some controversy with one of the sheriffs, Nick DeLuca, as I believe. And Jay Kelton.
A whole wiretapping case in court.
Yeah.
He ended up being acquitted, but that dragged on for years.
Yeah. But our motto was all the news that fit, we print. Give me back that one book. When I was going through some of my stuff here the other day, I ran across this thing and I thought it was really really good. I don't know how many of you know Daisy Anderson. She was a black lady out in Strawberry Park, and we got to be friends because she supposedly wrote a book about, she was married to a Civil War veteran and wrote this book From Slavery to Affluence, and I printed it for her because nobody gave her any money to do it, and so I printed it and said, Daisy, when you sell the books, you can pay me, and we did this over the years, and I don't know if any of you have her book, but it's kind of interesting. Do they have the book here at the museum?
I haven't seen it here.
I know it's kind of hard to find, but anyway, I printed it 3 or 4 times, but when I retired in 1991, she wrote me this letter. This is the letter. It's a little note, but I thought it was pretty good. This is to advise you that I regret to see you retire. I'd like you to be the editor as long as you live, and I know that everything in this life comes to an end. Now as you're retiring, I do hope you'll keep busy. It's the key to being happy. I know you'll do that. I'm retired, but I'm a busy person. So here's a small gift to say happiness and warmth for you. I'll never see anything you do or say in your life as wrong. Happy retirement. Here's a check for $20 to go fishing. It is such a relief to sit by a stream and gaze in the water and watch the fish get fooled and hook themselves. But Daisy's like 90, I don't know, she's got to be 98 years old. She's in a nursing home in Denver, and I guess you can't really appreciate it unless you know her, but I thought this was pretty neat. So, I don't know, are there any other questions? I kind of covered, I didn't really get into anything too formal. I just tried to cover the highlights, but...
You're very close to golf.
What's your handicap?
Yeah. Actually, my handicap is my golf swing. That's why I'm going to golf school. I'm going to golf school for 3 days. It's costing me $800. That's why I can't pass it up. That shows how desperate I am. So maybe time for, is any other questions? Thanks for coming. I had this horrible fear last night that nobody'd show up.